A lot of people ask me, how on earth did you get into studying Sheela-Na-Gigs? I was an undergraduate and sort of bored with the whole thing, really, and was trying to decide what to do my dissertation on. And I was flipping through a book on women's history, and I had sort of got to the point where I was literally fanning the pages in boredom. And I flipped past one of these, and I thought, oh my gosh, what is that? And looked back and thought, I must know more about that. And from there, it was an interesting journey. I had to explain to my extremely conservative parents that I was going to be doing my dissertation more or less on ancient fannies. And then I had to give my dissertation, present it in front of the entire department. My professor, who is actually a very professional, very lovely man, sat up the end of the table, and he had this great bald egg-shaped head. And he sat there with his hands like this. And the only reaction was that his head continued to get redder and redder, and then eventually started to pour sweat. And I had sort of all kinds of plaques and things, replicas, and everyone sort of touched them with 2 fingers as though they might catch something. And the girls looked at me and said, "We're not with her." And the men looked at me and thought, "Something's wrong with you." And the department head came up to me after, and he said, "I've never seen anyone single-handedly embarrass an entire department. Congratulations." But needless to say, it went well. Breaking it to friends and their families is a bit interesting. Naturally, I wanted to see them in person. So when I came over, I stayed with a friend and his family. And his mother, bless her, offered to take me out in her car gigging. And we were looking for hours at these, and she was a bit horrified at first. By the end, she was, getting into it, and her youngest son rang and said, "Mum, where are you?" And she said, "I'm out looking for ancient fannies." And there was a very long pause. And her son said, "Mum, aren't you a bit old for that?" So needless to say, she arouses many different reactions. Depending on what your slant on life is, really. I think she is important to everyone, and I hope you learn a little bit about her today. So, what's in a name? What is Sheela-Na-Gig? The truth is, there is no consensus on what the name means. It doesn't directly translate from Irish. It doesn't have its roots directly in English. Perhaps Sheela is an approximation of the Norman name Cecilia or Julia. The phonetic spelling of the Irish word she. There's no real consensus, as I said. The most interesting point, which the lovely man Jack Roberts, who wrote this book, if you've never read it, you really should. It's probably the only text I would recommend on Sheela-Na-Gigs, because it is just so well written and has pretty much everything all wrapped up in one. If you get bored, you can just walk out and buy this. But yeah, the most interesting part is na, because originally when it was written down, it was spelt with an N-I and a fada over the I, which means of the, like daughter of the, or descendant of. It translates into O. So names like O'Dwyer, O'Donnell are descendant of that person. So does she represent some kind of an ancestral figure, some type of a local feminine presence that was important as an ancestry link to an area? And just many different spellings as there are names. Local places tended to have their own names. Again, Kathleen Owen is a perfect example of, and Sheila O'Dwyer as well, are examples of ones that were named after women who were locally important in that area, women who were sort of matriarchs of their community. So basically, this is a Sheela-Na-Gig. This one comes from Herefordshire, and she's known as the Kilpeck Sheela. She's one of the best preserved Sheelas. The theory on that is that rather than actually being part of the furniture, as most of the other Sheelas are, She was perhaps part of a carving school. So people who went to learn the trade of church carvings would have used her perhaps as an example, or perhaps she's the work of a student, we don't really know. But she is one of the best preserved because of that. As you can see, her main feature would be her yoni, which she is showing unashamedly. Not something you would expect to see on a church, but they are found on churches throughout quite a lot of the country. Their main concentration is in Ireland, although there are several throughout Britain. There are several actually in the local area to here, in Oaksey, in Whittlesford, South Taunton in Devon. We have one in Wells, which is just up the road, which is, yeah, definitely, they're everywhere. It's one of those things where no matter where you go, she seems to turn up. And you don't really notice if you're not looking for her. Some of them are very high up on walls, some of them are over doorways, but she's always there. Sheelas are found primarily on churches, over doorways or archways, over windows. There is a Sheela on this church. You can't see her terribly well, but she's just there under the clock. They're often tucked into corners, but they're also found on castles, which is important, and I'll discuss why later. And there's a single example that we know of a Sheela-Na-Gig on a standing stone, and of course they're in museums. There is a close-up of that Sheela on that tower that we just saw, which is even more interesting because of the accompanying male figure. There aren't a great many Sheelas that have companions like this. So this one's unique for a couple of reasons. She's unique because of the accompanying figure, but she's also unique because she's your typical idea of a fertility goddess. She's big-breasted, she's big-bellied. She's, the ideas of fertility that we think of in modern day. Not all Sheelas are like that. Some Sheelas are quite small and quite slim. This one is located above an archway of a ruined church. People would walk by and rub the Sheela-Na-Gigs over the yoni, which is why a lot of them have worn away. You can see she's rather well carved at the top, but this part has been worn away from years and years of people coming to rub her and to honor her in that way. And there are, of course, lots of examples in the British Isles and in Irish and English, Welsh, Scottish culture of using phallic symbols and yonic symbols. This is Megalithomania, which is just down in Cornwall. This is an example, again, of two phallic symbols flanking quite a feminine yonic symbol. And again, people pass through the stone for good luck. Good luck is another element of Sheela-Na-Gigs that we'll come to. So when were they made? There's a lot of speculation. The National Museum of Ireland dates them to the medieval period. Most of them are found on medieval churches. Sometimes the stones aren't congruous with the fabric of the church, which means they may have come from someplace else and been brought there, but that's mostly not the case. Mostly they are contemporary with the buildings they exist on, placing them quite firmly in the medieval period, in spite of, them looking like something that's sort of a throwback to the pagan era. It made researchers slightly uncomfortable to think about the fact that Sheelas were actually firmly within a Christian context. It was easy to look at them and say, oh, well, it's a throwback to paganism. We don't believe in that anymore, but, it's a relic, leave it. And when they said, actually, it's not quite that simple. These are specifically created for Christian churches. That didn't sit well with people, as you can imagine. Why were they carved? Again, we'll never really know. The only people who know why they were carved are the people who carved them. Or, someone magically turns up with a tome explaining why, but somehow I doubt that. Were they a representation of the pagan goddess of the life cycle and the land? Were they a warning against the sin of lust? There's a theory that perhaps they were an attempt at medieval pornography. Again, there are as many theories as you can possibly imagine, but I'll discuss a few of them in detail.